In this video, you're going to be creating a single function that's going to allow us to actually filter and sort the expenses data. So at this point, if I add 4 expenses in, I'm always going to see 4 expenses in the console. That's because we have 2 separate pieces of data. We have the expenses array and we have the filters object, but we're not using the two together to determine what expenses should actually be shown to the screen. So if I do add a text filter or I do filter by date, I actually want to see the subset of the expenses that actually match those filters. Now, we're not going to get this done by changing Redux at all. We're not going to change any of our reducers or action generators. We're not going to be adding new properties on to the Redux store, like filtered expenses, and we're not going to be changing this to store just a subset. Instead, after the fact, we're just going to pass the data into a single function. It is going to filter and sort the data, returning the visible expenses, and that's what we'll be able to show to the screen, or for now, just log to the console. To kick this off, we're going to create a brand new section up above, get visible expenses, and we're going to have a function by the same name, get visible expenses. And this one is going to be an arrow function, and it is going to take 2 arguments. First up, it needs the expenses. This is going to be the complete array that is going to be filtering and sorting. And second up, we need to know the filters. So I'm going to pass those in as well. Using these 2 pieces of data, we can calculate what the visible expenses should look like. For the moment, let's just go ahead and return all of the expenses, neither filtering or sorting. And then we're just going to add this call down below in store.subscribe. So right here, I can make a new const called state, and I'll set it equal to store.getState. So I'm going to get the entire state. This is the entire expenses array and all of the filters. Then I'm going to create another variable called visible expenses, and I'm going to set this equal to the return value from up above. Get visible expenses, which currently does nothing. And I'm going to pass in the necessary data. First up is the expenses, that would be state.expenses. And second up is the filters, which would be state.filters. Perfect. So we have the data passed in, and the last meaningful thing we want to do down here is log this to the screen as opposed to the raw data. So right here, console.log visible expenses, and the end result, if we were to run this code, should be us seeing the arrays printing to the screen. Currently we have none. If I uncomment out these add expense dispatch calls, we should see a couple added into the mix. I'm going to go ahead and comment out these ones down below, save the file, and what do we get? In the end of the day, we have an array with 2 items. And we would see those 2 items even if we did add filters in place. So if I did set this text filter to a text value of rent, it's not going to show just the one that happens to match that. Instead, it's still going to show both. So we want to go ahead and actually fix this. Now we have all of the data we need to get this done right here inside of get visible expenses. We have the array and we have the filters. All I'm going to do is destructure the filters, creating variables for the individual ones. So right here, we will grab those 4 things. First up, it was text. Then we had sort by. We also had start date. And finally, we had end date. Using these 5 pieces of information, we're going to be able to get the correct data coming back. Now, the first thing we're going to do is just filter the data without sorting it at all. So we're not going to worry about sort by. We're just going to worry about text, start date, and end date. To get this done, we can go ahead and kick things off down below. Right here, I'm going to call expenses.filter, allowing us to return a subset of all of the expenses. And in here, we are going to generate our arrow function. And we're going to get access to the individual expense, which is going to allow us to determine whether or not this should be included in the visible expenses. And as I mentioned, there are those 3 pieces of data that we're going to be using to determine this: text, start date, and end date. Filter doesn't really care about sort by. That'll come a bit later. So inside of filter, we're going to have those 3 things. And I'm going to make 3 consts to store whether or not they were matches. So right here, we will have a const for start date match. We're also going to have a const for end date match. And finally, we're going to have a const for text match. Now, if all 3 of these are true, then we have a complete match, and we want to return true from filter. So how are we going to do that? We're going to return only if start date match and end date match and finally text match. So if all of these are true, the filter function will return true and the item will be kept in the array. If any of these are false, the whole thing will result in false because we're using and, resulting in the item being removed from the array. So if it is a match in terms of date, but the text doesn't match, it's not going to be a visible expense, and this code will successfully result in it being removed from the screen. Now we're going to work through start date match and end date match together, and it'll be your job a bit later on to use text match. Now, if we're going to be sorting by start date and end date, which are just numbers, using expense.createdAt, which is also just a number, we should probably talk about exactly what these numbers are. These numbers are timestamps, and these timestamps are any positive or negative integer value. So a perfectly valid timestamp would be something like 33,400, the number 10, the number minus 203. These are all valid timestamps. Now, like our year system, they're counting based off of some metric. In this case, we can count off of years. We are sitting in the year 2000 and something, so we start at 2000, we then go to 2001, and we could also start at year 0. We could go backwards to the year -1. This is all perfectly valid. And the same thing is true with our timestamps. But timestamps aren't counting in years, they're actually counting in milliseconds. So these millisecond timestamps start at a certain point in time. Positive numbers go forward in time from that point. Negative numbers go backwards in time. So the question has to be asked, where is this specific spot? What does the timestamp 0 represent? Well, it actually represents January 1st at midnight in the year 1970. So this is known as the Unix epoch or epoch, depending on where you're from. And this specific date is the starting point for all of our timestamps. So positive numbers are going to come afterwards and negative numbers are going to be before. So what do we have right here? We have 33,400. This would be 33.4 seconds after January 1st, 1970. This one would be just a fraction of a second since we have 10 milliseconds and a second is 1,000 milliseconds. And this one would go back a little bit in time. So this would be a date very, very late in 1969. Now we're going to be using timestamps extensively in this course as a way to store time zone independent time data. And that is exactly what we have in start date, end date, and created at. So let's go ahead and actually add a little bit of filtering, getting this getVisibleExpenses function to do something meaningful. Let's actually use that information by setting up a value for start date match. We're going to kick things off by checking the type of start date. So if the type of start date is not equal to a number, this is always going to result in true, and that's okay. If start date is undefined, we're not going to take it into account when it comes to actually filtering. That means this will always be true for non-numbers, and we're not actually going to ever get into a situation where the start date has an effect on whether or not an expense is visible. Only if start date is a number do we want to actually filter expenses. So right here, or, and we're going to look at the expense.createdAt value. Then we're going to check if it's greater than or equal to start date. So let's come up with some dummy data. Let's say start date is undefined and the createdAt value is 1. It's going to check if the type of this undefined value is not equal to a number. It's not going to be equal to a number, so this will result in true. Right here, this will get set to true, and the item won't be filtered. Now let's say start date is 2 and createdAt is 1. This isn't going to be true, which means this will run. Expense.createdAt is 1, start date is 2. It's not greater than the start date, so this one is going to get filtered out. Now if start date was 0 and createdAt was 1, createdAt would be greater than start date and it would once again be included. So this is the logic that we're going to be using for that start date match, and we're going to have the exact same logic down below just for end date. So we're going to check the type of end date. If it's not equal to a number, or right here, if the expense.createdAt value is less than or equal to end date. So we have the exact same logic in place for both of those, and we're using the inclusive greater than or equals or less than or equals. So it's okay if the two values are equal as long as one's not greater than the other. Now that we have this in place, we can actually test our work. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to go ahead and set up some expenses and set up some filters. So down below, we don't have a created at value for either of these. Let's go ahead and set those up. I'm going to set this first one to have a created at value of 1000. So this would be 1 second after January 1st, 1970. And for the second one, created at, I'll go ahead and use a negative value. So right here, I will set created at to minus 1000, which would be 1 second before January 1st, 1970. Now, all we need to do is actually set up these start date and end date filters. If I save the program as it currently stands, we are getting an error related to text match, so we can just set that equal to true. This is going to have no effect on whether or not an item gets filtered. We'll fill that out in a little bit. And if I save the file again, we are still going to get both items showing up. There is no filtering in place. Now though, I'm going to set start date to 125. Now, one of the items, rent, is indeed created after that, and one is created before it. So in the end of the day, we should just see one item showing up. If I save the program, that is exactly what we get. Right here, you can see we have rent, which has a created at value greater than the start date we just set up. Now, if I were to set this equal to minus 2000, this would be before all of our items. So we would expect all of our items to show up, and that is exactly what we get. We have both guys showing up. If I were to use positive 2000, I would expect nothing to show up since there are no items created after this point. And in the end of the day, we have a empty array printing. Now, the same thing is true with setting the end date. So let me go ahead and switch this up to 0, and I will uncomment this line. Now, in this case, we should have one match. There is one thing between these two values, and we get that one thing back. If I were to tweak this to 999, there would now be no expenses between those two values, and we would get nothing back. So we have the ability to sort by date, and it's working really, really well. We can now add those calendar pickers in. We'd be able to successfully sort and view just a subset of our expenses. Up above, there is just one thing left to filter by. We need to filter by the text. So if I do enter in some search text, I want to only show the expenses that actually use that text value somewhere. Now we have the description and the note field. For this one, I'm just going to check the description. I'm not going to worry about looking into the notes and seeing if there's a match there. The notes are going to be details shown on a separate page. When we view our list, we're just going to be viewing the descriptions, the amounts, and the created at timestamps. So we'll just search by those as well. That means right here, what you want to do is figure out if expenses.description has the text variable string inside of it. So for example, if the description is rent and the text string is RE, it would indeed be a match. RE is in the string rent, but if it was RED, it wouldn't be a match because the word red is not inside of the word rent. Now to get this done, you're going to have to use a few techniques. I recommend looking into the includes method. Includes allows you to see if one string includes another, and go ahead and use Google to figure out how that works if you haven't used it before. And I'm also going to recommend that you convert both strings to lower case. So by converting both strings to lowercase, you are creating a case-insensitive search. So if I have uppercase R rent and I search for lowercase r rent, I do want to consider that a match. So we do want to convert both of the strings to lowercase before checking if one includes another using includes. Take as much time as you need to get this done, and feel free to use the web to figure out how to get all of this done. Once you are done, you're going to want to go ahead and actually set up some text filters. So I'm going to comment out my date filters. Right here, I'm going to set up the text filter for rent. When I do that, I should just see one of the items printing to the screen, and the other one, coffee, should go away. Go ahead and knock all of this out, pause the video, test your work, and when you're done, click play. How'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to get that done without too much trouble. If you hadn't used includes before, all you really needed to do was Google something like JavaScript includes, and that should bring you over to the MDN website, the Mozilla Developer Network. Right here, there's some information on using includes with an array or using it with a string. We're going to be working with the string version, and if we pulled it up, we can see that we just call includes on a string, and we put the search string as the first argument. It's going to return true if this string is inside of this one and false otherwise. To actually use this, we're going to go ahead and switch back to the Expensify app and over to the editor. And right here, what I'm going to do is check if expenses.description includes the text value. And what we have here is a case-sensitive search. So if the description is capital R rent and the text is lowercase r rent, it's not going to be considered a match. We can fix that using to lowercase. So right here, we will convert description to lowercase, and then we'll check includes on the lowercase version. And right here, we're going to convert the text to lowercase as well. Now that we have both of them converted to lowercase, we have a case-insensitive search, and we can actually test our work. So I'm going to go ahead and save the Redux Expensify file. Over here, cannot read property to lowercase of undefined, which means I must have an error. Yep. Right here, I accessed expenses.description, not expense.description. Now, I could have edited this out, but real errors happen all the time. So it's important to remember that if you make errors, it's not a problem. The goal is to just get faster and faster at fixing them as you get more and more comfortable with the tools you're using. So what do we have here? I have a successful application running, and it is using my filter. Right here, I just have one item at the end. And if I crack that open, it is the one with rent in the word. So here we have a lowercase search rent using the uppercase rent description, and we are indeed finding that match, which is great. Now, if I were to just put in the letter E, that does indeed exist inside of both of them, so I would expect two items to be down here. And if I put in FFE, that should only exist inside of the description coffee, and down below, we can see that is the one item we get back. And now that we have all of our filtering in place, in the next one, we're going to go ahead and add the sorting, and then we'll be all done with the get visible expenses function. I'm excited to get to that, so stay tuned. I'll see you next time.